Why have you been carrying a CO2 monitor around with you the last 6 months, and what have you learnt by doing that?
I've learned that we live in a CO2 cesspit most of the time in interior environments. Outside environment is, CO2 is going up. You can believe that or not believe it. And it is one of the main causes of climate change. You can believe that or not believe it, but there are thousands of scientific studies showing that. So we've established that. Doesn't seem like, unless you're, someone who is extremely apprehensive about data measurements, right? There's not a lot of controversy with it, but indoor CO2 levels, I would call this an epidemic. It is so deplorable. And I had heard about this a long time ago and didn't do anything about it because I was just like, I don't need to be worried about something else. But finally, I got a CO2 monitor and started recording hotels, subways, bars, gyms, airplanes, and was absolutely horrified by what I've found. And what I've found is that we are spending most of our time in areas that have lower oxygen, that have higher CO2, and this is impacting our ability to think. It's affecting our bodies. It's affecting our sleep and more.
Yeah. And so I know you've mentioned airports, airplanes, hotel rooms, windows not being able to be open. Can you just give us a little sample of like what is a good CO2 level and what starts to happen once it goes? What's the numbers we should, if we're so inclined to get one of these CO2 monitors, what numbers would we start to be a bit concerned about?
So outside, the CO2 levels like what today? 418 parts per million, 419. It's going up every year, right? Inside, anything below 1,000 is considered good, right? Some people at 800 parts per million will experience some eye irritation, sore throat, that kind of thing. Anything above 1,200, 1,500, there was one study showing that at 1,500, a lot of people get headaches, they feel dizzy. A study of 24 employees showed that cognitive scores went down 50% when participants were exposed to CO2 levels of 1,400 parts per million or higher. 50% decline. These are real studies done by real researchers, and everything is accessible to everyone if you want to look it up yourself. So beyond that, a lot of bars and pubs are at around 2,500 parts per million, which means 1 in 17 breaths is someone else's breath backwash. And then it just gets worse from there. I'll stop there unless you want to go deeper and deeper.
So I'm just curious, like, so you took a 30% CO2 breath, I think you referenced in the book, or a couple of those, and I'm just going to paraphrase a bit here, so please correct me as I go through this. That can and will help your CO2 tolerance levels. When we're in a high CO2 environment, it's toxic. What's going on with this? Is it right to call it like an exogenous CO2 versus what our bodies produce? And what differences are going on there?
Yeah, it's so confusing. And just to be clear, I don't know all the answers in the CO2 world, and I'm actively trying to figure all of this out. So what I did with Dr. Justin Feinstein is I took one breath of CO2, right? So 30% CO2, one breath, which can help reset the brain, the nervous system, and more. We've known this for more than 100 years, that CO2 therapy is possibly the most effective therapy for anxiety, for panic, and for many other conditions. So we know that. That's one breath. I'm talking about breathing in and out for 8, 10, 12, 16 hours a day in an environment with very high CO2. And if there is high CO2, there is almost always lower oxygen, right? Those two things are almost always in parallel. You could probably get into an environment where you have higher CO2. As long as the oxygen is up, it could be really beneficial. But I think what is happening most of the time is it's lower oxygen, higher CO2, and you're just inhaling everyone else's exhalations. And we purge 70% of our toxins with our breath, with our exhalations. So you just imagine for a couple of hours, I'm sure it's completely fine. 1,500 parts per million, even 2,000 parts per million. But every single day, over and over, and this is really impacting our health, and no one's talking about it.
Incredible. Yeah, I've been very conscious of that since I heard you talk about it on Diary of the CEO, and I noticed my hotel rooms didn't open. But I was in Denver Airport a few months ago, and they have the CO2 levels on the wall, which I found quite interesting. So somebody's paying attention to it, which is pretty cool.
That is incredible. And that's what I hope will happen. So one day, I think if enough people get these CO2 monitors and start outing hotels that have hermetically sealed their window, you can't even open a window if you want. It's summertime. It's beautiful out. Can't open a window. And they're just recycling the air over and over because it helps them save a little bit of money on their energy bill, right? At the cost of our health. So I think if enough people start complaining, businesses are going to do something about this. And
Yeah,
that's what's the government's not going to do anything about it, at least this government here in the US, but maybe in other governments in other countries. And I know private companies want to respond to customers and
yeah.
don't start checking CO2 on long flights because it's an absolute disaster.